The morning. Clara Whitfield buried her pride was not the morning she buried her father. It was the morning her neighbor, Gerald Pruitt, rode his horse directly through her wheat field. Not around it, not beside it, through it. Trampling 6 weeks of growth into mud like it meant nothing, like she meant nothing. He pulled up to her porch, still in the saddle, and looked down at her with the kind of smile that men like him had been perfecting for generations. "Sell me the land, Clara. You're 2 payments behind. The bank won't wait forever, and neither will I." She didn't answer. She couldn't, because behind him, stretching all the way to the tree line, her father's wheat, her wheat, lay broken and flat in the dirt. If that had happened to you, if everything your family built was being crushed right in front of your eyes, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to you, if they make you feel something real, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every single story here is crafted for you. The people who know that life is complicated, that love is earned, and that strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, press that like button. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to Clara and the stranger who was about to change everything. Clara Whitfield had been waking up before sunrise since she was 9 years old. Back then, it was because her father needed help hauling water from the well before the day got too hot. Now it was because there was nobody else. The farm didn't care that she was tired. The wheat didn't care that she hadn't slept more than 4 hours. The 2 remaining horses didn't care that she'd cried herself into exhaustion the night before, sitting at her father's old desk with a stack of payment notices she didn't know how to answer. She was 26 years old, and some mornings she felt like 60. The Whitfield farm sat on the western edge of Callow Creek, a stretch of frontier land that the settlers had named with more hope than the land probably deserved. The soil was good when the rain cooperated, which it did about half the time. The other half, it was dry and cracked and stubborn, like it was testing whoever dared to plant something in it. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, had spent 31 years in a negotiation with that soil. When he died of a chest sickness the previous winter, he'd left Clara the farm, the debt, and the lesson that neither one of them would be easy to manage. She had no brothers, no uncles nearby. Her mother had passed when Clara was 14, quietly and without much warning, the way some people leave, as if they'd been preparing to go for a long time and simply chose a Tuesday morning to do it. So Clara managed. That was the word she used when neighbors asked how she was getting along. Managing. It was a word that kept people from pressing too hard, because it sounded like enough. It wasn't enough. But it was what she had. She was mending a section of fence along the north edge of the property on a gray October morning when she found him. At first she thought it was a pile of old feed sacks someone had dumped along the tree line. It wouldn't have been the first time. People passing through sometimes left things, broken tools, worn-out clothing, whatever they didn't want to haul further. She almost kept walking. Then the pile moved. Clara stopped. She stood very still for a moment, the way she always did when something unexpected happened, taking one long breath before reacting. Her father had taught her that. "Don't let your feet move before your head does," he used to say. She walked closer. The man was on his side, one arm folded beneath him at an angle that looked uncomfortable, his cheek pressed against the cold ground. He was breathing. She could see that, but it was shallow and uneven. His coat was torn at the shoulder, not freshly, but in the way fabric tears when someone has been wearing the same clothing through too many difficult days. He had no hat, no visible pack, no horse nearby. Clara crouched down and pressed 2 fingers against his neck to check his pulse, the same way she checked the livestock when they were sick. His skin was cold, too cold. "Hey!" She touched his shoulder. "Hey, wake up!" He made a sound. Not words, just sound. His eyes moved under their lids but didn't open. Clara stood up and looked around. The nearest neighbor was the Harlan farm, a mile east. Gerald Pruitt's land was closer, just across the creek, but she would walk to the Harlans and back twice before she'd ask Gerald Pruitt for anything. She made a decision. She always made decisions quickly when the options were limited. It was a practical skill, not a brave one. There was a difference. She went back to the barn, hitched the old mare to the flat cart, and drove it out to the fence line. Getting him onto the cart was harder than she expected. He was taller than he'd looked on the ground, and he stirred awake just enough during the process to make things more complicated rather than less, grabbing at her arm with a grip that surprised her and then immediately going limp again. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. "I'm just going to get you out of the cold." She settled him into her barn on a pile of clean straw, covered him with a wool blanket, and boiled water for broth, even though she wasn't sure he'd be able to swallow it. He slept for most of that first day. She checked on him 4 times. Each time she stood in the barn doorway and watched his chest rise and fall, trying to figure out what exactly she had brought onto her property. He didn't look like a criminal. She'd seen enough rough men come through Callow Creek to have some sense of the difference between a man who was dangerous and a man who was simply in trouble. But she also knew that wasn't a reliable measure. Trouble and danger could live in the same body without announcing themselves clearly. By evening, he was awake enough to sit up. She brought him the broth and a piece of bread and set it on the floor beside him without entering the barn fully. She kept the lantern in her hand, partly for light, and partly because it gave her something to hold. "You're on the Whitfield farm," she said, "north edge of Callow Creek. You were lying against my fence this morning." He looked at her. His eyes were a shade of brown that was almost gray in the low light, and they were clear. Clearer than she expected from a man who'd been unconscious in a field. Whatever had knocked him down, it wasn't drink. She'd seen enough of that to know. "I know where I am," he said. His voice was rough and quiet. "I've been following this fence line since yesterday." "Why?" He paused before answering. Not the way someone pauses when they're making something up, but the way someone pauses when they're deciding how much of the truth to share. "I needed somewhere to stop," he said. Clara watched him for a moment. "What's your name?" "Evan?" "Evan what?" Another pause, longer this time. "Just Evan, for now." Any sensible woman would have pushed him out of the barn right then. Clara knew that. She could hear her neighbor Ruth Harlan's voice in her head already. "Clara, you don't know the first thing about that man. You're out here alone. What is wrong with you?" What Clara said was, "You can sleep in the barn tonight. Tomorrow, you tell me if you need a doctor." "I don't need a doctor." "Oh, tomorrow," she repeated, and she left him there. She lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the wind against the windows and asking herself what exactly she thought she was doing. She didn't have a good answer. She had an instinct, and she'd learned, slowly, through a number of painful experiences, that her instincts were not always right, but they were usually worth paying attention to. Something about the way Evan had looked at her when she asked his full name. Not evasive, not nervous. Something closer to tired. Like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had gotten used to the weight. She knew what that looked like. She saw it every morning in the mirror. By the 3rd day, he was upright and moving around. She found him in the yard before she'd even had her coffee, looking at the section of collapsed fence along the eastern pasture that she'd been meaning to fix for 6 weeks and hadn't had time to get to. "That's been down since August," she said from the porch. "I can see that." He turned to look at her. "You got spare posts?" "In the shed, but you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He started walking toward the shed. Clara stood on the porch holding her coffee cup and watched him go. She wanted to feel suspicious. She wanted to feel cautious. What she felt instead was something she was reluctant to name, because naming it would make it real, and she wasn't ready for another real thing to manage. She felt relieved. Not relieved that a man was doing the work. She'd been doing the work herself for months, and had proven well enough that she could. She was relieved in a different way. The way you feel when you've been holding your breath for so long that you've stopped noticing, and then suddenly you breathe again and realize how much effort that holding had required. She went inside and poured a second cup of coffee. Evan fixed the eastern fence that day. The next morning he was up before her, mucking out the horse stalls. She came out to feed the animals and found the work already done, and Evan sitting on an overturned bucket eating the last of the bread she'd left outside the barn the night before. "You didn't have to do the stalls," she said. "I know." She looked at him. He looked at the ground. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You're good at knowing what you don't have to do," she said finally. "How long since you've eaten a real meal?" He considered this with more seriousness than the question warranted. 5 days. Maybe 6. "Come inside," she said. He hesitated in the doorway the way she'd hesitated in the barn doorway that first night. The same instinct, maybe. The one that says, if I cross this threshold, something changes. He came in. She made eggs and salt pork, and there was coffee left. And he ate like a man who was trying not to appear as hungry as he was, which meant he was very, very hungry. She didn't ask him questions during the meal. She didn't like being interrogated while she was eating and assumed he didn't either. They sat in the quiet of her father's kitchen, with the sounds of the farm outside and the smell of coffee and wood smoke inside. And it was the most peaceful 15 minutes Clara had experienced since her father died. When he finished eating, he put his fork down carefully and looked around the kitchen in the way people do when they're actually seeing a place for the first time. "Your father's farm?" he asked. "Mine," she said. "He left it to me." "How long have you been running it alone?" "8 months." He nodded. He didn't say that's impressive or that must be so hard the way people in town did, with that particular combination of admiration and pity that Clara had come to find almost physically irritating. He just nodded, the way you nod when someone tells you a fact that deserves acknowledgement but not performance. She appreciated that more than she expected to. "I can keep working," he said, "while I'm here, whatever needs doing." "And how long are you planning on being here?" He looked at the table. "I don't know." "Evan." She waited until he looked up. "I need you to tell me one true thing. I'm not asking about your past or your family or your last name. I'm asking one thing. Are you running from something that's going to show up at my gate?" He held her gaze. And this was the moment, the one she would think about later, much later, when everything had changed, where she made her read of him. She had been reading people her whole life, the way you do when you grow up in a place where you can't always afford to be wrong about someone. "Not yet," he said, "but I won't lie to you. It might." She thought about Gerald Pruitt riding through her wheat field. She thought about the bank notices. She thought about the 8 months of mornings she'd faced alone. "All right," she said, "the barn's warmer on the south side. There's an extra blanket on the hook near the door." He looked at her for a moment, like he was trying to figure out what kind of person would make that calculation and land where she had. She stood up and started clearing the dishes. "The fence along the creek is going to need attention before winter," she said. "Posts are rotting at the base." "I'll look at it tomorrow," he said. And that was how it began. Not with any particular decision, not with any real plan, just two people, each carrying something they hadn't put down in a long time, agreeing to do the next practical thing. The neighbors noticed, of course. In Callow Creek, the neighbors always noticed. Ruth Harlan came by on a Thursday with a pie. Always a pie, Ruth, as if sugar could soften whatever uncomfortable thing she was about to say, and stood on Clara's porch looking past her toward where Evan was working at the creek fence. "Clara." Ruth's voice had the specific texture of concern that is mostly curiosity. "Who is that man?" "He's helping with the farm." "Does he have a name?" "Evan." "Evan what?" "Ruth." Clara kept her voice even. "Thank you for the pie." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Your father would have been more careful." It was a sentence designed to land, and it did. Clara felt it in the way you feel a slap. Not just the initial sting, but the heat that follows. She took the pie and smiled in the way she'd learned to smile at things that hurt. "My father is gone," she said. "I appreciate you coming by." After Ruth left, Clara stood in the kitchen holding the pie and letting herself be angry for exactly 2 minutes. That was her private rule. 2 minutes for the feelings, then back to the work. She'd made the rule after her mother died, and she'd found that grief could consume whole days if you let it. 2 minutes. Then you put it somewhere and you moved. She put the pie on the counter and went back outside. Evan was still at the creek fence. He'd pulled out 4 of the rotted posts and was measuring the new ones against the holes. He did this, she'd noticed, without being told how, which meant he knew how. He'd known how to do everything she'd pointed him toward, and he'd done it right the first time, which was more than she could say for the boy she'd hired briefly in the spring before she'd run out of money to pay him. She walked down to the creek and stood beside him. "Mrs. Harlan thinks you're a problem," she said. "She's probably not wrong." I didn't say I agreed with her. He drove a post into the ground with 2 clean strikes of the mallet and didn't answer. "Do you have anywhere else to go?" she asked. She meant it practically. She needed to know how to think about the arrangement. He set down the mallet. He looked at the creek, which was running low and brown the way it always did in late autumn. "No," he said. And then, after a moment, "Not anymore." There was something in the way he said it. not anymore, that told her there had been a somewhere, that there had been a life that looked different than this one. She didn't ask about it. She'd offered him the same privacy she wanted for herself. Then we should figure out something more formal, she said. People are going to talk regardless, but at least if there's an arrangement with some structure to it, there's less to talk about. He turned to look at her then, really look at her. The way he did sometimes. This careful, measuring look that was not unkind but was very serious, like he was trying to read something that mattered. What kind of arrangement? He said. Clara crossed her arms. She'd thought about this more than she was willing to admit. She'd turned it over in her mind through 2 sleepless nights, approaching it from different angles, trying to find the flaw in it, because there was always a flaw, and it was better to find it yourself than have someone else find it for you. My father left this land to me, she said. But the bank has been patient because they knew him. That patience is running thin. I'm behind on payments, and I can't catch up without help I can't afford to hire. She paused. You need somewhere to be. You have skills. You work harder than anyone I've ever seen, and I have no idea why, but I don't think you're lying to me about the important things. And, he said, and there's a minister in town who performs services without requiring families to be present. The silence that followed was complete. Even the creek seemed quieter. You're talking about marriage, Evan said. I'm talking about a solution, Clara said. If you have a better one, I'm listening. He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. She'd offered what she'd offered, and she wasn't going to dress it up or apologize for it. Clara, he said, and it was the first time he'd said her name. I have nothing, no money, no land, no name that means anything to anyone around here. I know that. You'd be marrying a man you don't know. I'd be marrying a man who fixed my fence, mucked my stalls, and told me the truth when I asked him to, she said. I've known men my whole life who didn't do any of those things. Something moved across his face then, something she couldn't fully read. Not happiness exactly, but something quieter and more complicated. Like a man who'd been told something he'd stopped expecting to hear. You deserve more than this kind of arrangement, he said. Maybe, Clara said, but this is what I have, and I'm not in the habit of turning down what's in front of me because I'm waiting for something better. She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him standing at the creek with the fence posts and the mallet and whatever it was she'd just placed into his hands. He came to the door that evening. She opened it before he knocked. She'd heard his boots on the porch, and they stood looking at each other through the open doorway with the cold air moving between them. Yes, he said, just that. One word. Clara nodded. I'll send word to Reverend Marsh in the morning. She closed the door and stood in her kitchen for a moment, alone, with the fire going low in the stove and her father's coat hanging on the hook by the door. She didn't know what she'd just done. She knew it was practical. She knew it was necessary. She knew that the man on her porch was not who he said he was. Not because she'd caught him in a lie, but because she had spent enough of her life reading people to know when someone was carrying a name they'd decided to set down. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, standing in her father's kitchen on that cold October night, was what name he'd left behind. And what would happen when that name came looking for him? Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony on a Wednesday morning, which was the quietest day in Callow Creek, when most people were either out working their land or occupied enough with their own lives to not be standing in front of a church watching 2 people do something the town had already decided was a mistake. There were no guests. Clara had not invited anyone, and Evan had no one to invite. The Reverend's wife served as witness, a small woman named Dottie, who smelled like lavender and had the particular quality of a person who had seen enough of life to withhold judgment, or at least to keep it to herself. Clara wore her good dress, the dark blue one she'd worn to her father's funeral, and to 2 other occasions since that she couldn't remember now. It was the only dress she owned that wasn't stained with work. Evan wore the same clothes he always wore, but he'd washed them, and his hair was combed back, and he'd borrowed a razor from somewhere because the rough beard was gone and his jaw was clean. And Clara noticed, quietly, privately, in the way she noticed most things, that he looked younger without it, and harder, somehow. Like the softness the beard had given him was covering something else, some quality of his face that was more difficult to read. She thought about that for a moment and then let it go. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Reverend Marsh read what he read. They said what needed to be said. And then it was done. Dottie cried a little, which Clara thought was both kind and slightly strange, given that Dottie didn't know either of them. Outside the church, standing in the gray morning air with the sound of someone's wagon moving down the main street in the distance, Evan looked at Clara and said, "Thank you." Clara adjusted her gloves. "It was practical," she said, "for both of us." "I know it was." "Good." They drove back to the farm in her cart, sitting close enough that their elbows touched occasionally on the rough parts of the road, and neither of them moved apart. That was all. It was not romantic, and it was not cold. It was two people who had made an agreement and were now figuring out what that agreement actually felt like from the inside. Back at the farm, Clara changed into her work clothes and went out to check on the south field, because the wheat she'd managed to salvage after Gerald Pruitt's horse had trampled the north section needed to be assessed before the first hard frost. She didn't ask Evan to come. He came anyway, walking a few feet behind her, and when she stopped to crouch down and examine the roots of the damaged plants, he crouched beside her and looked at what she was looking at. "Recoverable?" he asked. "Some of it." She pressed the soil near a root cluster. "This section here probably not, but if the frost holds off another 2 weeks, the eastern rows might make it." He nodded. He didn't offer an opinion on what she should do. She appreciated that. She'd had enough of men who looked at her problems and immediately began solving them in the wrong direction. They assessed the whole field together, and Clara made notes in her head. She'd never been much for writing things down, preferred to carry the information where she could access it fast. And by the time they were done, the morning was half gone, and the cold had settled in earnest. Inside, she made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table. And this was when it started to feel real in a way the ceremony hadn't quite managed. Sitting across from someone at your own kitchen table, in your dead father's house, with the understanding that this person was now here in a permanent and legal sense. That was when the weight of the decision arrived. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him. "We should have some rules," she said. Evan raised an eyebrow very slightly. "Rules. Practical ones. I'm not talking about anything strange. I mean about the farm, about how we handle decisions, about money, when there is any." "All right," he said. He said it the way he said most things, without fuss, without getting ahead of where the conversation actually was. "The farm is mine," she said. "My father left it to me. That doesn't change. I never thought it did. I'm not saying it to be unkind. I'm saying it so we're clear. Clara." He put his cup down. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here because you let me stay. Everything that's yours stays yours." She studied him for a moment. There it was again. That quality she couldn't quite pin down. The way he said things like "everything that's yours stays yours" with such total absence of bitterness, like a man who had genuinely let go of the idea of owning things. Most men said something like that with at least a flicker of resentment underneath it. Evan said it like he meant it so completely it had stopped being complicated. "You're a strange man," she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. He almost smiled, not quite, but something moved near the corner of his mouth. "I've been told." "I don't mean it as an insult." "I know." The first week of their marriage was mostly silence and work, which suited both of them in ways they didn't articulate. Clara was not a talker by nature. She'd grown up with a father who expressed affection through showing up and getting things done, not through conversation. And Evan seemed to operate on the same principle. They worked. They ate. They said what needed to be said about the farm and the daily logistics of it, and they did not push into territory that wasn't ready to be entered. But small things accumulated the way small things do. Clara noticed that Evan always left the last of the coffee for her, even when he'd clearly been up longer and needed it more. She noticed that when her old dog, a slow-moving hound named Brackett, who was approximately 11 years old and smelled like wet earth. No matter how often she washed him, limped up to Evan on his third day in the house, Evan sat down right there on the kitchen floor and talked to the dog in a low, serious voice like they were having an actual conversation. She noticed that when she was frustrated, and she was frequently frustrated because the farm gave her plenty of material to work with, Evan did not try to fix her frustration or talk her out of it. He just stayed nearby and let her work through it, which was exactly what she needed and something most people in her life had never managed to figure out. She was not falling in love with him. She told herself that with some regularity. This was practical. This was an arrangement. She was noticing things about him the way you notice things about anyone you live in close proximity to, the way you build a map of a person through daily observation. That was all. She told herself that on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into their marriage, when she woke up in the night and heard him moving around in the kitchen and went down to find him sitting at her father's desk with a piece of paper and a pencil, doing calculations by lamplight. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He didn't look guilty exactly, but he looked like a man who had expected to be alone. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." She'd been half awake anyway, listening to the wind. She came into the kitchen and sat in the chair by the stove. "What are you figuring?" He hesitated. Then he turned the paper so she could see it. It was a rough accounting, the farm's expenses on one side, the current income on the other, and a column in the middle she couldn't immediately make sense of. "You're missing something in the soil rotation," he said. "If you put winter rye in the east field after the wheat harvest, it puts something back in the ground. Means you spend less on amendment in the spring." Clara looked at the numbers. She looked at his calculations. She looked at him. "How do you know about soil rotation?" she asked. A pause. The familiar kind. The one she'd come to recognize as the pause that preceded whatever version of the truth he was willing to offer at that moment. "I've seen it done," he said, "on a farm I spent time near." "Whose farm?" "It doesn't matter now." He set the pencil down. "The numbers work, is the point." She looked at the paper again. The numbers did work. She could see that. The calculation was not just correct, but it was the kind of correct that suggested he'd been thinking about this farm specifically, its particular balance of debt and potential, and had worked out a path through it with more care than she'd have expected from a man who claimed to know nothing about land management. "You're educated," she said. It wasn't a question. "Some. More than some." He didn't deny it. He also didn't confirm it. He picked up his pencil and made a small notation in the margin of the paper. Clara sat with that. She sat with it the way she sat with most things that needed thinking, without pushing, without demanding, giving it room to resolve on its own. "The winter rye," she said finally. "How much seed would we need?" He told her. He also told her where she could get it at a reasonable price, naming a supplier 2 towns over that she'd never heard of, and he told her this with the casual precision of someone who knew the regional market well enough to navigate it without looking it up. Clara filed this away and said nothing about it. The next morning, she found him in the barn before dawn, and she realized that this was now simply the shape of her days. Finding Evan somewhere on the property, already working, the farm slowly coming back to something that resembled order. Gerald Pruitt came by on a Friday. Clara saw his horse coming up the road from the kitchen window and felt the specific tightening in her chest that Gerald Pruitt reliably produced in her. She set down her coffee cup and straightened, taking one of those long breaths her father had taught her. Evan was in the yard splitting wood when Gerald arrived. Gerald pulled his horse up and looked down at Evan with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't expected and didn't particularly like. "Who are you?" Gerald said. Evan set his axe down against the block and looked up. "Evan Whitfield," he said. It was the first time Clara had heard him use her name, and the plainness of it, the easy, uncomplicated way he said it, like it fit, did something to her that she didn't have a ready category for. Gerald looked from Evan to the house and back. "Where's Clara?" "Clara. Inside. I'll talk to her directly." "She can hear you from there," Evan said. He wasn't unfriendly about it. He was just very still in the way that suggested he was capable of being very still for a very long time, and Gerald's comfort with that situation was not particularly relevant to him. Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he raised his voice toward the house. "Clara, Clara, I need a word." Clara came outside. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed, and she looked at Gerald Pruitt with the expression she had spent years perfecting, civil enough to avoid open conflict, flat enough to offer nothing he could use. "Gerald," she said, "I heard you took in a stranger." Gerald's eyes moved to Evan and back. "Didn't realize you'd done more than that." "What do you need, Gerald?" "I came to talk about the North Field, the section along the creek that borders my property." He shifted in his saddle. "I've made an offer to the bank. If your payments fall further behind, they've agreed to transfer that section to me rather than call the whole debt." The cold that moved through Clara at those words was not the kind that came from weather. "You talked to the bank," she said. I have a relationship with the bank, Gerald said. I'm offering you a clean solution. You keep the main property. I take the creek section, which I've had my eye on for years anyway. Everyone walks away. Everyone walks away, Claire repeated. Her voice was very level. Except I lose a third of my land. A third you're not farming effectively anyway. Gerald. She came down off the porch. She walked toward him until she was close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. Get off my property. Gerald looked at her. He looked at Evan, who had not moved but whose stillness had shifted in a way that was harder to define. It was the same stillness, but it had a different quality to it now, like weather that has decided what it's going to do. You're being unreasonable, Gerald said. I'm being clear, Claire said. There's a difference. Goodbye, Gerald. Gerald held for another few seconds, long enough to make his point about who he thought he was, and then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Clara stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded. Then she turned and walked back toward the house without looking at Evan, because she did not want to show him what was on her face right now, which was not anger and not fear, but some combination of the two that she did not have a clean word for. She heard him fall into step behind her. Inside, she went to the desk and pulled out the bank papers she kept in a locked box in the bottom drawer. She spread them on the table and looked at them the way she always looked at problems, straight on, without softening the view. The numbers were what they were. She was behind. Not catastrophically, not yet, but Gerald Pruitt had not made up the part about the bank's patience thinning. She'd had that conversation with the bankman herself 2 months ago, sitting in an office that smelled like old paper and failed hopes, listening to a man who was sorry but also had responsibilities to the institution, and these things had a process. Evan sat down across from her. He looked at the papers. Can I look? He asked. She slid them toward him. He read through them slowly. He read them the way someone reads something they're genuinely absorbing, not skimming. When he was done, he set them down and laced his fingers together on the table and looked at them for a moment before looking at her. How much time do you have, Gika? He asked. 2 months. Maybe 3 if I can make a partial payment. Where would the partial payment come from? The wheat harvest? What's left of it? And I was thinking about selling the second horse. Don't sell the horse, he said. You need both horses to work this land. I need to make a payment more than I need 2 horses. You won't need any horses if you lose the farm. She looked at him. He was right, and she knew it. She hated that the math worked the way it worked, but it did. Then what? She said. Evan picked up the pencil from beside the papers. He started writing numbers. Clara watched him write and felt something she couldn't entirely name, some mixture of gratitude and discomfort, because being helped was something she had almost forgotten how to do. And the forgetting had been deliberate, because needing help and not having it available was a particular kind of pain she'd learned to avoid by simply not needing it. Having it available now felt strange. Good strange, but still strange. The rye crop will help in the spring, he said, but that doesn't solve the immediate problem. He tapped the pencil against the paper. What about the Harlan farm? You said Ruth Harlan is your nearest neighbor. Do they share your water source? The same creek, yes. And Pruitt's been eyeing the creek section. For years. Evan set the pencil down. If Pruitt controls the creek access, the Harlans lose as much as you do. Have you talked to them about it? Clara looked at him. Ruth Harlan came over with a pie to question my judgment about my marriage. That's not a no. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. He was right again, and that was becoming a pattern that she was going to have to figure out how she felt about. The Harlans wouldn't, she started. They might, Evan said. If they understood what Pruitt's actually doing, he's not just after your land. He's positioning himself to control the water access for this entire section of the creek. Anyone downstream loses leverage. Clara sat back. She had understood in a general way that Gerald Pruitt was building something. She had not laid it out this specifically in her own mind. The clarity of it, spread out in the shape that Evan had just given it, made something tighten in her chest. How do you know what he's doing? She said. Because I've seen it before, Evan said. Men with money and patience and a long view. They don't come at you all at once. They take a piece here, arrange something there. By the time most people understand what's happening, it's already happened. You've seen it before, Clara said. She was watching his face carefully. Where? The pause, the familiar, controlled, deliberate pause. Different place, he said. Doesn't matter, the pattern is the same. Clara did not push. She made a note of it in the part of her mind where she kept the things she was still working out about him, and she moved on. I'll go see Ruth Harlan tomorrow, she said. Take the numbers. I will. She started gathering the papers together, stacking them neatly the way her father had always done. And she was aware of Evan watching her do it. Not in an uncomfortable way, just watching. With that careful attention he brought to everything, like the details of things mattered to him in some private way he never fully explained. Evan, she said, without looking up. Why are you helping me this hard? The question landed in the quiet between them. She heard him shift slightly in his chair. Because you let me stay, he said, when you didn't have to. She looked up at him. He met her eyes and did not look away. That's the whole reason? She asked. He thought about it, really thought about it. In that way he had that made her believe he was actually considering the question rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. No, he said. But it's the truest short version. Clara looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded and went back to the papers. She went to see Ruth Harlan the next morning. She took the numbers, as Evan had suggested, and she left her pride at home, which was harder. Ruth met her at the door with the expression of a woman who was not entirely surprised by the visit and had been waiting to see what Clara would do with whatever she'd come to say. They sat at Ruth's kitchen table and Clara laid it out. Not the emotional version, not the version where she was asking for sympathy. The plain version, with the numbers and the facts and the map of what Gerald Pruitt was building, piece by piece, along the creek. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was not something Ruth typically managed, and that alone told Clara that the information was landing where she'd hoped it would. He came to see us too, Ruth said when Clara finished. 2 weeks ago. Said he was interested in buying a small section of our eastern pasture, near the creek. Clara felt the pieces click together. He's buying up the whole bank. My husband told him no, Ruth said, but he'll be back. They looked at each other across Ruth's kitchen table, and something shifted between them. Not a full repair of whatever had been strained, but the beginning of one. What do you need? Ruth said. A partial payment on my loan. Enough to buy me until spring. I can pay back whatever you're able to give, with interest, once the spring crop comes in. Ruth was quiet for a moment. How much? Clara told her. Ruth didn't flinch at the number, which was either reassuring or alarming, and Clara couldn't decide which. I'll talk to my husband tonight, Ruth said. Come back Thursday. Clara drove home in the flat cart with the cold air hitting her face and something in her chest that might have been hope, which was a thing she'd been handling carefully for months. Picking it up, examining it, putting it back down before she could drop it. She found Evan at the house when she got back. He was on the porch with Brackett, who had installed himself with his head in Evan's lap in the specific way that dogs do when they have decided something is true about a person. How did she take it? Evan asked. She's talking to her husband. Thursday I'll know. That's good. It might be good. Clara sat down in the other chair and looked out at the yard. Don't count it yet. I won't. Brackett made a long, comfortable sound and repositioned his head. Evan's hand moved absently over the dog's ears, and Clara watched this without meaning to, the way the motion was completely unself-conscious, and thought again that this was a man who had learned somewhere how to be still and easy with the things in front of him, and that it was a rare quality, and that she did not entirely know where it had come from. The evenings had developed a shape over the weeks. They ate dinner together, meals that had improved slightly now that there were 2 people eating, because Clara found herself cooking with slightly more effort than she had when she was cooking for herself alone. Afterward, Evan often read. He'd found a small shelf of her father's books and worked through them with the unhurried concentration of a man who genuinely liked to read, not one who did it out of obligation. Clara did her accounts, or mended things, or sat with Brackett and stared at the fire. One evening, she looked up from her mending and found Evan watching her. What? She said. Nothing. He looked back at his book. You're staring. I was thinking. About? He closed the book around his finger to mark his place. About how you never complain. Clara considered this. About what specifically? About any of it. He gestured vaguely at the room, at the farm, at the general accumulated weight of her situation. The debt, the land, Pruitt, the fact that you're keeping a farm alive alone. You never say, you never sit down and say, this is unfair or this is too much. Would that help anything? She said. It might help you. It might, she agreed. But I was raised by a man who thought the best response to a hard thing was to do the next hard thing. It's a habit. Your father sounds like someone worth knowing, Evan said. Clara felt it, that small, clean ache that grief produces when it's not fresh anymore, but it's not gone either. He was, she said. He wasn't perfect. He was stubborn to the point of damage sometimes. He held grudges longer than made any sense. But he was honest, and he worked hard, and he stayed. She paused. Staying. That was his thing. Some people leave. He always stayed. Evan was quiet for a moment. That matters to you, he said. Staying. It's the only thing that actually proves anything, she said. Anyone can feel something. Staying is the proof. She didn't know why she'd said that much. She wasn't given to talking about herself at this level, generally. There was something about the evening light and the warmth of the room and the way Evan listened, without preparing his response while she was still talking, that had loosened something she usually kept shut. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. It was not pity, and it was not the soft, slightly uncomfortable compassion people offered when they wanted you to stop being sad so they could stop witnessing it. It was something else, something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, something like recognition, like a man who knew what staying cost because he had failed to do it once and understood the weight of that and had not fully put it down. She didn't ask. She picked up her mending and went back to it, and after a moment he opened his book again, and the fire crackled, and Brackett snored from the rug, and the evening settled back into its shape. She was not falling in love with him, but something was happening. She could feel it in the way you can feel weather changing, not seeing it yet, just the pressure shifting, the air going quiet before whatever was coming. On a Thursday in late November, Ruth Harlan's husband came to the farm with a banknote and a handshake and the uncomfortable but genuine warmth of a man who had decided to trust someone and was hoping he'd made the right call. Clara shook his hand and thanked him without the emotional display he was probably expecting, and after he left, she stood in the kitchen for a long moment with the banknote in her hand. She had 3 months, maybe 4, if the harvest numbers held. She went outside to tell Evan. He was at the eastern fence, of all places, the section she'd found him near all those weeks ago. He heard her coming and straightened up and turned, and when she told him about the Harlan loan and what it meant, he didn't cheer or make a speech or do anything dramatic. He just nodded, slowly, and something in his face settled. 4 months is enough, he said. Enough for what? To make enough changes that the spring puts you ahead instead of behind. Clara looked at him. The cold air moved between them. His breath misted slightly. He looked the same as he'd looked on the day she'd found him on the ground next to this fence. Same worn coat, same careful eyes, same quality of carrying something he hadn't put down. Except not the same. She was close enough to him now, had spent enough mornings and evenings in the same rooms with him to know the difference between the surface and what was underneath it. And underneath what she'd seen that first morning was a man who was more complicated than his coat suggested, and more deliberate than his silence suggested, and who was, despite all her practical intentions and rational framing, becoming something to her that she had not budgeted for. Why do you do that? She said. Do what? Say things like 4 months is enough, like you know what's coming. He looked at her steadily. I don't know what's coming. You say it like you do. I say it like I intend to make sure it's true. He paused. There's a difference. Clara looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at the fence, the repaired fence, the one he'd fixed on his 3rd day on her property, the posts driven clean and straight, the wire tight. Come eat, she said. It's getting cold. He fell into step beside her, and this time walking back toward the house through the pale November afternoon. The space between them was different than it had been the first day she'd walked this same ground. Narrower, maybe. Or not narrower, just comfortable. The way space can stop being something you measure and just become where you are. Neither of them said anything about it. They went inside and she put water on for coffee, and Brackett lifted his head from the rug and thumped his tail once against the floor, and the farm was quiet around them except for the wind and the particular small sounds of a house that has people in it. For the first time since her father died, the house sounded like it had people in it. That should have been enough. That should have been all of it. The arrangement she'd proposed, the practical solution she'd needed, the man who fixed fences and didn't complain and turned out to be exactly what she'd asked for. It should have been enough. But people are not good at enough. Clara Whitfield had known that her whole life, and she had been proud of being the exception to it, and she was beginning to suspect, standing at her father's stove in the thickening dark of November, that she was not as exceptional as she'd thought. Somewhere in the territory, on a road she didn't know, a well-dressed man was asking questions about a missing heir. He had a name written in a leather journal, underlined twice. Evan Hawthorne. I was getting closer. December came in hard that year, the way it sometimes did in that part of the territory. Not gradually, not with the polite warning of a few cold nights and some early frost, but all at once, like a door slamming shut on everything that had come before it. The creek froze at the edges first, then deeper, and the ground turned iron hard overnight so that the fence posts rang like metal when Evan drove them. Clara could see her breath from the moment she stepped off the porch each morning, and the sky sat low and white and heavy in the way that meant more weather was thinking about arriving. They had developed, by December, a life that had its own particular rhythm. Not the rhythm she'd had with her father, which had been built over decades and carried the specific weight of blood relation and shared grief, and the kind of ease that only comes from knowing someone so long you stop noticing them. This was different, newer, more deliberate. The rhythm of two people who were still, even after 2 months of mornings and evenings in the same rooms, paying a certain quality of attention to each other. The kind that hasn't yet decided to relax. Clara noticed things. She kept noticing things. She noticed that Evan read the same page of a book 3 times if something was worrying him, the page turning and returning without his seeming to realize it. She noticed that he was careful with money in a way that didn't match a man who had nothing. Not tight, not anxious, but precise. The way someone is precise when they've learned that imprecision has consequences. She noticed that when strangers came to the property, which happened occasionally, a peddler, a passing rider asking for water, Evan always positioned himself where he could see the road, and his attention sharpened in a way that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. She filed all of this away. She did not speak it aloud. She had made him a promise of sorts, not an explicit one, but the kind that exists in what you choose not to ask, and she kept it. The rye went into this east field in the first week of December, before the ground froze completely. Evan had timed it carefully, watching the weather the way he watched everything, with that patient, systematic attention that was either the habit of a farmer or the habit of a man who had learned to read environments carefully, and she still wasn't certain which. She was in the barn late one afternoon, the light going amber and long through the gaps in the boards, when she heard horses on the road. More than one. She didn't think much of it. The road past her farm connected to the market town, and there was always some traffic, especially before the deep freeze made traveling unpleasant. She went back to what she was doing. Then she heard Evan. Not his voice, his silence, the specific sudden quality of it that she had learned to distinguish from his ordinary quiet. She looked up and saw him through the barn door, standing in the yard, completely still, watching the road. His hands were at his sides. He had set down the tool he'd been carrying, and she could see it on the ground beside him, dropped rather than placed, which was not like him at all. Clara came to the barn door and looked at the road. 2 riders. Both well-dressed in the way that read as money. Not the practical warmth of working people, but the kind of clothing that announced its own cost. The one in front was perhaps 50, with a gray mustache and a straight back and the expression of a man accustomed to finding what he was looking for. The one behind him was younger, perhaps a clerk or an assistant, holding a leather case across his saddle. They pulled up at the gate. The older man looked at the property. He looked at Evan. Something moved across his face. A recognition, immediate and certain, the kind that doesn't need to think about it. He removed his hat. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, "we've been searching a considerable time." The name hit the air and stayed there. Clara did not move. She stood in the barn doorway with her hands at her sides, the cold coming through the gaps in the boards around her, and she waited to feel something, shock maybe, or confusion. What she felt instead was a strange, spreading calm, the way your body sometimes goes quiet when it receives information it was already, in some unreachable part of itself, prepared for. Evan turned around. He looked at her before he looked at the rider. That was the first thing she noticed, that his first instinct was not to deal with the man at the gate, but to look at her. His face carried something she had not seen on it before, which was the particular expression of a person whose secret has arrived to speak for itself, and who does not yet know what comes after. Then he turned back to the road. "Gideon," he said. His voice was very level. "How did you find me?" "With difficulty," the man called Gideon said, "and considerable expense. Your uncle is not a patient man, as you know." He looked at Clara briefly, then back at Evan. "He'd like you to come home." Evan said nothing for a moment. Clara watched the back of him, the set of his shoulders, the stillness that was different from his usual stillness, pulled tight instead of resting. "He'd like," Evan said, "or he's demanding." "Mr. Hawthorne, answer the question." Gideon adjusted slightly in his saddle. "There are matters that require your presence. The railroad contract. The land deeds in the Northern District. Your uncle has managed as long as he's willing to manage without you." Clara heard this. She heard the words railroad contract and land deeds, and she placed them beside everything she had filed away over the past 2 months. The soil calculations, the regional market knowledge, the way he'd read Gerald Pruitt's maneuvering as if he'd seen it from the inside, the precise handling of money, the books on her father's shelf that he'd moved through like someone revisiting familiar country. She placed it all together and she looked at Evan and she understood. "Give me until morning," Evan said. Gideon looked uncertain. "The weather—" "There's an inn in Callow Creek. The town is 4 miles east." Evan's voice did not invite argument. "Morning?" Another pause. Then Gideon replaced his hat and nodded once and turned his horse, and the younger man followed, and Clara watched them ride back down the road until they were gone. The yard was very quiet. Evan picked up the tool he'd dropped. He turned it in his hands. He did not turn around. "Clara," he said, "don't." Her voice came out clean and flat, which surprised her because what was moving through her was not clean or flat at all. "Don't say anything yet." She went inside. She stood in her father's kitchen for a long time. She did not sit. She stood at the window and looked at the yard and then at the frozen edge of the creek and then at the east field where the rye was in the ground, put there by a man whose name she had never actually known. Evan Hawthorne. She turned the name over in her mind. She had heard of the Hawthornes. Everyone in the territory had heard of them, the same way everyone had heard of the mountains in the distance. Not because you'd been there, but because they were large enough that their existence shaped the landscape around them. The Hawthorne family controlled land in 4 counties. They had stakes in the railroad expansion that was coming, the one that every small town along the route was either hoping for or afraid of, sometimes both. They were the kind of family that appeared in conversations as a reference point for size and power. Well, the Hawthornes own that, or the Hawthornes have an interest in it, the way you'd reference a river or a mountain, something that simply was, that the smaller things arranged themselves around. And she had been feeding him from her kitchen. She had made him coffee and given him her father's blanket and married him in an 11-minute ceremony while Dottie cried and she pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table. She had told him, in the dark of the evening with the fire going low, that staying is the only thing that actually proves anything. She had said that. She had said it to a man who had a mansion somewhere and a family with railroad contracts and had chosen to lie in the dirt next to her fence with an empty pocket. She heard the door. She did not turn around. "I was going to tell you," Evan said. His voice was quiet. He was standing just inside the door, which she could tell without looking because she could hear where his voice was coming from and because she could feel the cold that had come in with him. "Were you?" she said. "Yes." "When?" The pause was longer this time. "I don't have a good answer to that." "Then don't offer a bad one." She turned around. He looked the way she'd expected him to look, which was like a man who is not going to make excuses and knows that not making excuses is insufficient and is standing in the gap between those two facts without knowing how to cross it. He had taken off his coat. He was holding it. He looked, she thought, younger than he'd ever looked before, and also older, and she was aware of looking at him as though she were seeing 2 different people in the same place, which was close to accurate. "Say it," she said. "Say all of it." Evan set his coat on the hook. He came to the table and sat down, not across from her but at the corner, close, so that she could see his face clearly. My name is Evan Hawthorne, he said. My family has held land in this territory since before the railroad. My father died 4 years ago. My uncle has been managing the family interests since then, which he has done competently and with an enthusiasm I find difficult to stomach. There are 200,000 acres under the Hawthorne name. There are contracts with the railroad that will be worth more than most people in this territory will see in 3 lifetimes. And there is an expectation that I will return to manage my share of it and conduct myself accordingly. He said all of this without inflection, the way you recite something you've said before, internally, many times. And the wagon accident, Clara said, that was real? That was real. He looked at his hands. I was traveling alone, which I did sometimes, which my uncle considered reckless, and which I considered necessary. The wagon lost a wheel going downhill. I lost the horse. I lost everything I was carrying. I walked 2 days before I reached your fence line. He paused. That part is exactly what it looked like, except you had a name worth 100 wagon loads. Yes. Clara sat down. She needed to sit down, not because her legs were weak, but because standing felt like it required energy she wanted to spend on thinking. Why didn't you tell me, she said. Because… He stopped, pressed his lips together briefly, started again. Because I've spent my entire adult life watching what my name does to rooms. I walk into a place and before I've said 10 words, people are rearranging themselves. What they say, what they offer, what they want from me, what they show me of themselves. He looked at her directly. You didn't know. And you were exactly who you were. Every day. You were the same in your kitchen and in the field, and when Pruitt tried to take your land. You didn't perform anything for me because you didn't know you were supposed to. So I was what? An experiment. No. His voice shifted, firmer. Not an experiment. Clara, the way you treated me was the first genuine treatment I have received from a stranger in more years than I can accurately count. I know that is not a justification. I know what it cost you to offer it, and I know I used it without giving you the information you deserved. I know that. He looked down at the table. I'm not asking you to forgive it tonight. I'm asking you to let me explain it, and to know that the man you have known for these 2 months is not a fabrication. I am exactly who I have been with you. The name is the part that's been hidden, not the man. Clara looked at him for a long time. She was looking for the seam, the place where what he was saying pulled against what she knew to be true from watching him daily. She looked for it carefully, the way she examined soil or fence posts, not hoping to find damage, but not willing to miss it if it was there. She couldn't find it. That was the most complicated part. She could not find the seam because everything she knew about him was consistent. The way he moved through the farm, the way he'd talked to Brackett, the way he'd made calculations at her father's desk in the middle of the night, not because he had to, but because the problem was there and he wanted to solve it. The way he'd looked at her in the kitchen when she talked about her father, not with the polite sympathy of someone performing interest, but with the particular attention of someone receiving information that genuinely mattered to them. None of that had been performance. She was a good enough reader of people to be fairly certain of that, which meant something that did not make her anger easier to manage, because a lying man was a simpler problem than a man who was essentially true but had done something false. What happens now, she said. That depends on you, he said. Does it? She heard the flatness in her own voice. You have railroad contracts and 200,000 acres and a family that sends riders. Does it really depend on me? Everything about my life here depends on you, he said. I married you. That was real and I meant it, and I still mean it. I'm not going to unmean it because Gideon showed up at the gate. Clara stood up. She needed to move. She went to the stove and checked the fire, which didn't need checking, and then stood with her back to him for a moment. You let me borrow money from Ruth Harlan, she said. Silence. You sat across this table and you helped me work out how to scrape together enough to make a payment on a farm that you, with your railroad contracts, could have bought outright and left as a gift. You let me worry. You let me go to Ruth with my hat in my hand and ask for a loan like a woman with nothing. Yes, he said. His voice was very quiet. Why? Because it wasn't my money to use. Not here. Not in this. She turned it around. What does that mean? It means that the moment I used the Hawthorne money to solve your problems, everything changed. You would have known where it came from. You would have felt the weight of it. You would have started to wonder if everything I did was coming from that money, if my being here was a kind of purchase. I didn't want that. He looked at her steadily. I wanted to earn it. Whatever I could earn here, I wanted to earn it with what I actually had, which was my hands and my knowledge and whatever time you'd give me. Clara stared at him. That's... She stopped. She was trying to decide if that was noble or outrageous or both, and was landing on both with some force. I know, he said. I know it doesn't fix the part where you were worrying while I said nothing. I know that. You should know that, she said, because that part is real and it sits badly and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. She turned back to the stove. She needed another minute. She took it. The kitchen was warm. Brackett was at her feet, having relocated from the rug without anyone noticing, doing the thing he did where he pressed himself against her ankles so that she could feel the warmth of him. She looked down at him, 11 years old and still following her around, still insisting on being in the same room, the way he'd done since her mother died and her father had brought home a wiggling 6-week-old hound, and said, "Here, this one needs you and you need something to need." She thought about her father. She thought about what he would have done, standing in this kitchen with this information. She thought about his particular brand of stubbornness, which she had inherited and which had kept this farm alive, and also, on several memorable occasions, made her life significantly harder than it needed to be. He would have been furious, she thought. He would have said nothing for 2 days and then asked the right questions. She turned around. I need to know one thing, she said, and I need the full true answer, not the version that's trying to make me feel better. Evan nodded. When you said yes to marrying me, she said, was that... She stopped, started again. Was any part of that because I was useful? Because you needed shelter and a name and a plausible story for when your family came looking? The question hung in the air between them. She watched him receive it, watched the way it landed, the slight tightening around his eyes. No, he said. Evan. No. Firmer. I'll admit to everything I've done wrong here, and there's a list of it, and I know it. But that's not on the list. I said yes because you were the first person in a very long time who looked at me, not the name, not what I was worth, and offered me something real. A real problem, a real arrangement, real consequences either way. He paused. I said yes because I wanted to stay, and I don't mean on the farm. Clara looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. You're going to have to do better than that, she said. I know. Gideon comes in the morning. You're going to have to talk to him, and you're going to have to talk to me about what that conversation is going to be, and I'm going to need to understand what this looks like going forward, what you're telling your family, what they're going to know about me, what they're going to expect. Yes. And I am going to need time to decide how I feel about what you've told me tonight. Yes, he said again. I'm not saying I'm done, she said. I'm saying I'm not ready to say I'm not done. There's a difference. He nodded. It was a very controlled nod, careful, the kind that means the person behind it is holding something still with effort. Clara picked up her lamp. The fire in the main room needs banking. I assume you know how to do that. I do. Good night, Evan. Good night, Clara. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of him moving through the house below her. The quiet, familiar sounds of the fire being banked, the water crock being checked, the door that stuck slightly in cold weather being eased shut rather than forced. All the small domestic sounds of a man who had learned this house over 2 months and moved through it with the ease of someone who had stopped being a guest without either of them marking exactly when that had happened. She lay there for a long time. Evan Hawthorne, 200,000 acres, railroad contracts, a family that sent riders, the man who sat on her kitchen floor and talked to her dog, the man who had driven fence posts at sunrise in a torn coat because the posts needed driving, the man who had told her that first day she'd properly fed him, that he had nothing and had been telling the truth in every sense that mattered and lying in the one sense she'd failed to check. She turned on her side and looked at the dark window and thought about what her father would have said. He was not a romantic man. He would not have said anything about feelings or hearts. He would have said something like, Clara, figure out what's actually broken and what just looks broken. She thought about that. She thought about it for a long time. Downstairs, she heard Brackett settle on the floor outside her door, where he'd taken to sleeping since the cold came in. And she heard the house go quiet, and she heard nothing else and knew that Evan was either very still or very far away inside himself, which in her experience were the same condition expressing itself two ways. She slept finally, because she was a practical person, and lying awake had never solved anything, and the morning was going to need her in full. Gideon arrived at 7, which was earlier than morning strictly required but was consistent with the behavior of a man who worked for impatient people and had taken on some of their qualities. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horses. She poured a third cup of coffee without thinking about it, which told her more about what she'd decided in the night than her conscious mind had quite caught up with. Evan came in from outside. He'd been up before her, which was usual, and he'd done the horse stalls, which was also usual, and his coat was cold when he passed close to her in the kitchen, which told her it had been a long outside morning. He looked at her face. He read it the way he read most things, carefully, with that attention that she'd stopped finding uncomfortable somewhere around the 4th week and started finding something closer to comforting, which had been an adjustment in her self-understanding. "How are you?" he said. "I've had better mornings," she said. "I've had worse." "That's something." "It's not much." "No," he said. "But it's what's here." She handed him the third cup of coffee and went to the window to watch Gideon come up the road. And she thought about what was actually broken and what just looked broken, and she thought she was beginning to know the difference. Gideon dismounted at the gate. He came up the path with the manner of a man who had rehearsed this, which made sense. He had probably been rehearsing this since the moment he'd been sent to find Evan Hawthorne, practicing the version that would work, trying to anticipate resistance. Clara opened the door before he reached the porch. She looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at her with the specific expression of a man encountering a variable he hadn't been given enough information to calculate. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He came in. He sat at the table. Evan was already there with his coffee and his hands flat on the table and his face carrying that look she'd come to know well. The one that meant he'd made a decision, and the decision was fixed, and what remained was the conversation about it. Gideon looked between them. Clara sat down. "Whatever my uncle wants," Evan said, "I'll address by letter initially. I'm not leaving until the spring thaw." Gideon opened his mouth. "The railroad contract can wait," Evan continued. "It has been waiting. 3 months more won't change its value." "This is a man who has been managing fine for 4 years and will manage for 3 more months." Evan picked up his coffee cup. "You can tell him I'm well. You can tell him I'll write this week. And you can tell him—" He paused, and Clara watched him make a small internal adjustment, something landing that he'd been carrying for a while. "Tell him I've made a marriage." Gideon stared at him. "Tell him it's real," Evan said. "And it's mine. And it comes before the contract." The silence in the kitchen was complete. Brackett lifted his head from the floor, looked at all 3 of them, and put his head back down. Clara looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. The hands of a woman who had run a farm for 8 months alone, who had mended her own fences and buried her own father and borrowed money from a neighbor and planted rye in the east field to reclaim what the frost took. She looked up. "Tell him," she said to Gideon, in her level voice that gave nothing away and meant every word, "to take his time." Gideon looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has just revised his assessment of a situation significantly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Outside, the light on the frozen creek was hard and white and sharp, and the sky was still low and heavy with weather coming, and the east field was quiet under its thin layer of frost, the rye beneath it doing what rye does, waiting, enduring, taking its time to become what it was going to be. Clara Whitfield, Clara Hawthorne, though she had not yet tried that name in her own mind, was not ready for that yet. Sat at her kitchen table and looked at the man across from her and felt the particular vertigo of standing at the edge of something that has already begun, something that was already irrevocably in motion, and understanding that the only real question left was not whether to step forward, but what you were going to carry with you when you did. Gideon left that morning with his coffee half finished, and a message he hadn't expected to be carrying, and Clara watched him ride back down the road until the sound of his horse was gone and the yard was quiet again with just the wind and the distant sound of the creek running slow under its ice. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel something clean after that conversation. Relief, maybe, or the particular satisfaction of having handled something difficult without flinching. What she felt instead was the way you feel after a fever breaks. Wrung out. Clearer than before, but aware that clarity is not the same thing as healed. Evan was still at the table when she came back inside. He had not moved in the way that told her he'd been sitting with something heavy, turning it over, the way he did when he was working through a problem that didn't have clean numbers attached to it. She sat down across from him. They looked at each other for a moment, the kind of moment that happens between people who have said large things and now have to figure out what the ordinary next minutes look like. I'm going to need to understand it all, Clara said. Not today, but soon. All of it. What the Hawthorne name actually means, what your uncle expects, what those contracts involve, what happens when your family learns that you married a wheat farmer in a borrowed church. She paused. I'm not going to pretend I'm not in the middle of something I don't understand yet. I want to understand it. I'll tell you everything, Evan said. Whatever you want to know. I want to know why you left, she said. Not the wagon, before the wagon. What made you leave in the first place? He looked at the table. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, or might offer the short version, the one that was technically true but didn't open anything. He didn't. He took a breath, and he opened it. My father died 4 years ago, he said. I told you that. What I didn't tell you is that he died in the middle of a negotiation, a land deal that my uncle had constructed, a consolidation of properties in the northern district that required my father's signature and that my father had been resisting for 2 years. My father had doubts about what the consolidation would do to the people who were farming those properties, the small holdings along the river that would be absorbed if the deal went through. He paused. My uncle is not a cruel man. He's efficient. There's a difference that I think matters morally, but it doesn't always matter in terms of outcomes. Clara listened. She listened the way she had always listened to things that mattered, without interjecting, without preparing her response while the other person was still talking. My father signed the deal 2 weeks before he died, Evan continued. I don't know if he'd changed his mind, or if he was too sick to keep resisting, or if my uncle wore him down. I was not in the room. I have thought about whether I should have been in the room, and I have not arrived at an answer that satisfies me. He looked up. When my father was gone and I was suddenly the man with the name, the first thing my uncle did was schedule 12 meetings in as many days with men who wanted things. Money, contracts, agreements, access. All of them had been waiting politely while my father was sick, and the day after we buried him, they were at the door. Clara said nothing. She thought about her own days after her father's death. The bankman and Gerald Pruitt, and the stack of payment notices, the world arriving with its demands before she'd had time to put down her grief. I handled it for a year, Evan said. I was not good at it, and I did not become good at it, and every decision I made felt like it was pulling me further from something, though I couldn't have told you at the time what that something was. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. And then I started taking trips. Alone. Not business trips. Just away. I'd tell my uncle I was inspecting one property or another, and sometimes I was, and sometimes I just needed to be somewhere that nobody knew me. That's when you were traveling when the wagon went down, Clara said. Yes. Where were you going? Nowhere, he said. That was the point. Clara looked at him. There was something in that. Nowhere, that was the point. That she understood in a way she hadn't expected to. She had never had the option of going nowhere. She had always had somewhere she needed to be, but she understood the desire for it, the specific suffocation that produced it, and she understood it more than she'd have admitted to most people. And then you ended up at my fence, she said. And then I ended up at your fence. He met her eyes. I told you the truth about what I said to myself in that first week. I was going to tell you. When I was well enough, when I'd been here long enough to know that that this was... He stopped. I kept moving the line forward. I said I would tell you once I'd proven I could be useful. Then once I'd been here a month. Then I told myself I would tell you before we married, and then that morning came and I looked at you in that dress, and He stopped again. Clara waited. I was afraid, he said. It came out simply, without decoration, which made it worse and better at the same time. Not of you. Of what would change. Of watching your face go from the way it was to the way people's faces go when they learn the name. That thing that happens. And I had come to, what I have here with you is the first thing that has felt like mine in 4 years. Mine and real, and not built on anything I was given before I had any say in it. He exhaled. That is not an excuse. It's a reason. I understand the difference. Clara sat with that for a moment. You said you were afraid of my face changing, she said. What do you think is on my face right now? He looked at her carefully. She let him look. I don't know, he said. I've been trying to read it since last night, and I can't. Good, she said. That's probably accurate. She stood up and picked up her empty cup and took it to the sideboard. I'm going out to the east field. The frost last night was harder than I expected, and I want to check the rye. I'll come, he said. I know you will. She said it without inflection, without invitation or refusal, and he put on his coat and followed her out. And they walked to the east field in the pale winter light and checked the rye together, crouching in the frozen rows and pressing the soil, and neither of them saying anything about the conversation they'd just had. Because some things need to breathe before they're spoken again. And Clara had learned that trying to process things before they were ready was like pulling at a knot with wet hands. You just pulled it tighter. The rye was fine. Dormant, not dead. There was a difference, and Clara knew how to see it. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the weeks before Gideon's arrival. Not worse, exactly. Not better either. Different in the way that things are different after something has been named. The thing is the same thing, but you see it clearly now instead of around the edges, and that clarity changes the shape of your daily experience with it. Evan wrote to his uncle the next day, a long letter that he wrote at her father's desk while Clara did accounts at the kitchen table, and she did not ask what was in it, and he did not offer. What he did say, setting the sealed envelope on the table, was, I told him I'll come in March, to address the contracts in person and introduce my wife. He said it plainly, looking at her. If that's agreeable to you. Clara looked at the envelope. And if I refuse to be introduced? Then I tell him you're not available, Evan said, and I find a different arrangement. You'd do that. Yes. She looked at him. Why? Because this is not a negotiation about your life, he said. You didn't agree to join the Hawthorne family. You agreed to marry me. Those things have turned out to be connected, but they're not the same thing, and I'm not going to pretend they are. Clara looked at the envelope for another moment. I'll meet your uncle, she said, but on my terms. What terms? I'll know them when the time comes. Something that might have been relief, genuine, uncomplicated, the kind you feel when you've been carrying something and someone takes hold of the other end, moved across his face. All right, he said. All right, she said, and went back to her accounts. It was Ruth Harlan who told her, on a cold January afternoon when she'd come over with more pie and considerably less judgment than her previous visits had carried. They were sitting in Clara's kitchen, which felt fuller these days, in a way that had nothing to do with furniture, and Ruth was talking in the circling way she had that meant she was approaching something she wasn't sure would land well. People are talking, Ruth said. They always are, Clara said. About Evan, about who he is. Ruth set her cup down and looked at Clara directly, which at least had the virtue of getting to it. Someone in town recognized the name, from the Gideon man asking around before he found you. People know. Clara absorbed this. She had expected it. Callow Creek was not a large town, and large names traveled fast in small places. And, Clara said, and there are people, Gerald Pruitt is one of them, who are saying that Evan Hawthorne is going to use his family's money to buy up the creek section for himself, that he planned it, that he found you and married you to get access to the land. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Gerald Pruitt, Clara said, says things that are useful to Gerald Pruitt. I know that, Ruth said. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm saying you should know it's being said. Does your husband believe it? Ruth looked uncomfortable. He believes it's worth asking. Clara set down her own cup carefully. Evan has never mentioned buying this land or any land near here. He has helped me figure out how to keep what I have. If he wanted to use his family's money to buy the creek section, he'd have done it without marrying me first. She paused. And he married me before anyone here knew who he was, including me. Ruth looked at her. You didn't know? Not until December. Ruth's expression went through several adjustments. Oh, Clara. Don't oh, Clara me, Clara said. I made my own decisions, and I'll manage my own consequences. She picked up her cup again. Tell your husband that Evan Hawthorne has done nothing to this land or this family except fix what was broken and plant rye in the east field. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "I'll tell him," she said, and then more quietly, "Is he good to you?" Clara thought about this. She thought about the coffee always left in the pot for her. She thought about Brackett on the kitchen floor. She thought about everything that's yours stays yours, and I said yes because I wanted to stay. "Yes," she said. "He's good to me." Ruth nodded again in the way of someone who has been worrying about something and can now put it partially down. What Clara didn't say, what she was still working out how to say even to herself, was that good to her was not the complete picture. Good to her was the floor of it, the basic condition. What was above the floor was something she hadn't had a name for since her mother died, and she'd locked that particular room and left the key somewhere she'd stopped looking for. She was looking for it again now, carefully, without admitting to anyone, including Evan, that she was looking. Gerald Pruitt came to the farm on a Thursday, which was a day Clara would not have chosen for him, being the day she typically did her most detailed accounting work, and having to stop in the middle of a column of figures put her in a specific kind of bad mood. He came alone this time. No horse riding through the wheat. The field was frozen now anyway. Just Gerald at the gate in his good coat, with the expression of a man who had decided something and come to deliver it. Evan was on the roof of the barn when Gerald arrived, fixing a section of shingles that had lifted in the last wind. He came down the ladder and stood in the yard, which meant he was between Gerald and the house, which Clara noticed and which she thought was either instinctive or deliberate and possibly both. Clara came off the porch. "Gerald," she said. "Clara." Gerald's eyes moved to Evan and sharpened in the way they do when a person is trying to recalculate something. "Mr. Hawthorne." Evan said nothing. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at Gerald with the quality of attention that Gerald was clearly not comfortable with, and that Clara had come to understand was not hostility, but was the thing that sits right before hostility if the situation required it. "I came to make a business proposition," Gerald said, man to man. He was still looking at Evan. "There's no men-only business on this property," Clara said. "Say what you came to say." Gerald adjusted. He did not like adjusting, which was visible. "The creek section. I know the bank situation has improved temporarily, but the Harlan loan comes due in 6 months. The spring crop may or may not cover it. I'm offering a fair price for the creek section, and I am prepared to extend it in writing today." Evan said, "What's your interest in the creek?" Gerald looked at him. "Water access. Development potential." "Railroad," Evan said. Gerald's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I don't know what you—" "The Eastern Spur," Evan said. "It's routing through the creek valley. That's been in discussion for 8 months. If you own the creek section, you control the access point, and you're in a position to negotiate a premium easement fee when the railroad comes through." He said all of this evenly, without heat. "I'd estimate you're looking at 10 years of income in a single negotiation. The Whitfield farm is worth considerably more than you've been offering." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man who has been seen clearly and knows it and is deciding what to do with that. "You have access to the railroad plans," Gerald said. Not a question. Something in his voice had changed. The bluster was gone, and what was underneath it was more honest and more calculating. "I have access to a great many things," Evan said, "including the relevant land assessments for this section of the territory." He looked at Gerald steadily. "The creek section is worth 4 times what you've been offering. Clara knows that now. The Harlans know that now. I'd suggest that whatever you came here with today, you bring something better next time, or save yourself the ride." Gerald looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Looked at her the way men like Gerald looked at women who had gotten outside the lines he'd drawn for them, with the particular frustration of someone whose plan has become inconvenient. "You've been very lucky," Gerald said to her, and the way he said it made it clear he did not mean it as a compliment. "Goodbye, Gerald," Clara said. He left. His horse moved fast down the road, which told Clara he was angrier than he'd shown, which told her they'd hit something real. She stood in the yard after he was gone and looked at Evan. "You knew about the railroad spur," she said. "Yes." "How long?" "Since before the wagon accident." He looked at her steadily. "The routing was still in discussion when I left, but the likely outcome was clear." Clara let that settle. "And you didn't tell me." "I should have." He said it without hedging. "I told myself I was waiting until I was certain. The truth is, I was waiting because telling you meant explaining how I knew, and that was the conversation I kept avoiding. He paused. I'm done avoiding it. Whatever you want to know about the railroad or the land value or the Hawthorne family's involvement in the regional development, I'll tell you. All of it. Tonight, tomorrow, whenever you're ready. Clara looked at the road where Gerald had gone. She thought about the creek section, that stretch of land her father had walked every spring to check the water level, that she'd walked with him from the time she could keep up, that she'd loved in the specific way you love places that have your history embedded in them. Worth 4 times what she'd thought. Because of a railroad. Because of information she'd had no access to. Because of the world her husband had come from, which was a world where that kind of information moved through the air like weather, available to anyone inside it and invisible to everyone out. Tonight, she said, after dinner. He nodded. She walked back to the house. Brackett appeared at the door and pushed his nose against her hand, and she let him, and she stood on the porch for a moment before going in, looking at the east field and the frozen creek, and the section of barn roof where the new shingles were laid in clean, straight lines. She had a thought, standing there, that she hadn't allowed herself before. Not a comfortable thought, but an honest one. The man she'd married had lied to her by omission, and that was real, and it had cost her things, and she was not going to minimize it. But the man she'd married had also, quietly and consistently, been exactly what he'd said he was in every way that touched her directly. He had stayed. He had worked. He had told her the truth about the railroad today when he could have kept it to himself, could have let her go on not knowing, and the only reason to tell her was because she had the right to know. Staying, telling the truth when it mattered, her father's measures. Not the only measures, but the first ones. She went inside. Dinner that night was quieter than usual, not tense, just loaded, the way evenings are when there is a large conversation waiting at the end of them. Brackett ate his scraps from the floor beside the stove, which he was technically not supposed to do and which nobody enforced anymore. Clara cleared the dishes. Evan sat at the table. "Where do you want me to start?" he said. "The railroad," she said. She sat down. "Everything you know about it. The route, the timeline, who's involved, what it means for the creek section. Start there and tell me all of it." He told her all of it. It took more than an hour. He talked about the eastern spur route and the land assessments and the families who were positioned to gain from the routing and the ones who'd lose depending on how the easements were negotiated. He talked about the Hawthorne family's involvement, not in the routing itself, which was a government matter, but in the secondary negotiations, the access fees and the development rights that attached to properties along the route. He explained it with the same precision he'd used on her farm accounts, mapping it out in numbers and relationships that she could follow, because he was explaining it to her the way she preferred, as a capable person who needed information, not as someone who needed to be protected from it. She asked questions. She asked good questions, which she could tell he noticed, and which she was not sorry for him noticing. When he finished, she sat with it for a few minutes. "Gerald Pruitt is not the only one trying to buy along the creek," she said. "No, there are 3 others I know of. He's the most aggressive, but not the most resourceful." "And the Hawthorne family?" Evan was quiet for a moment. "My uncle has an interest in the development rights for the northern section. Not this property, but adjacent." "Does he know about this farm?" "He does now." Clara looked at the table. "Does that concern you?" "Somewhat," Evan said. He said it honestly, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated reassurance. "My uncle is not a man who acts against his own family, but he is a man who sees opportunity and moves toward it. If he understands that this farm is sitting on a valuable access point, he will want to involve himself." "And you'll let him?" "No." Simple, clear. "This farm is yours. What's yours is yours. I told you that on the first day and I meant it. Even if the Hawthorne money could, even then." He met her eyes. "Clara, there are 100 things I've done wrong in this. There are conversations I should have had earlier and information I should have shared and a morning I should have told you before Gideon arrived so that you didn't have to hear it from a stranger at your gate. I know all of that. But this, your farm, your independence, your right to make decisions about what you own without my family's hand in it. I am not getting that wrong. I don't care what my uncle wants." Clara looked at him for a long time. "What does your uncle think of the marriage?" she said. "He hasn't said, in so many words." "What have his words been?" Evan's expression shifted slightly. He asked if you were from a good family. And you said? I said you were from the best family I'd encountered. He said it without any dramatic quality, as a plain statement of fact. Clara looked away. She looked at the fire, which needed another log and was going amber and low. You know that's a very particular thing to say, she said. I know. I'm not ready to deal with that sentence tonight. I'm not asking you to. She got up and put another log on the fire. She stood with her back to him for a moment, one hand on the mantel, watching the new wood catch. Here was what she knew. She knew the list of his failures, which was real, and added up to something she was not going to pretend was small. She knew the list of his truths, which was also real, and which she kept returning to not because she was looking for a reason to forgive him, but because she was trying to understand what she was actually working with. She knew that she had slept better in the last 2 months than she had in the year before them, and that this was partly the practical relief of having help, and partly something else she was still learning to look at directly. She knew that when Gerald Pruitt had stood in her yard and said, "You've been very lucky," she had wanted to say something sharp and clear back at him, not in defense of her circumstances, but in defense of her choice, her deliberate, considered, not entirely logical choice. She turned around. I want to talk to your uncle, she said. Before March. I want to write him a letter. Evan looked surprised for a brief moment, which was unusual for him. What would you say to him? I'd tell him who I am, she said, before he decides who I am for himself. Because men like that, men with that kind of power and that kind of certainty, if you let them form a picture of you before you've shown them the real one, you spend years trying to undo it. She looked at Evan directly. I've been managing that kind of man since my father died. I know how it works. Evan was quiet for a moment. Something was on his face that she almost recognized. That look she'd caught glimpses of before, the one that was too complicated for a single word, that seemed to involve several things at once. Write the letter, he said. I'll see that it reaches him directly. I'll write it tomorrow, she said. She picked up her lamp. The evening was done. She could feel it. Not because the conversation was finished, but because she'd reached the point where more talking would only circle what had already been said, and she needed to be alone with it. Evan? She stopped at the foot of the stairs. He looked up. You asked me once why I never complain, she said. You said you didn't know how I carried it without putting it down. I remember. I carry it because I don't have a choice, she said. That's the truth of it. It's not strength. It's just the absence of an alternative. She paused. But the last 2 months they've been less heavy than I expected them to be. I don't know yet what to do with that. I don't know if it changes anything. But I'm telling you because it's true, and you asked me once for one true thing, and I think that's fair. She went upstairs before he could respond, because she'd given him the true thing, and she needed it to have been enough on its own, without a reply attached to it, without knowing immediately what it did to him. She heard him, a long time later, banking the fire. She heard the careful sounds of him moving through the house. She heard him stop at the foot of the stairs for a moment. Not going anywhere, just stopping. Then she heard him go to the main room, and the familiar sound of him settling in for the night, and the house going quiet. In the east field, under its crust of frost, the rye was doing what dormant things do, holding its structure, waiting for the conditions to change, neither dead nor fully alive, but present, patient, taking the cold as it came and trusting that the cold would eventually end. Clara lay in the dark and thought that there were worse things to be like than winter rye. She thought that for a while, and then she slept. Clara wrote the letter to Edmund Hawthorne on a Friday morning, sitting at her father's desk with the good pen she kept in the left drawer for occasions that required it. She wrote 3 drafts. The first was too formal. She could hear herself performing something, arranging words into a shape designed to impress rather than communicate, and she threw it in the stove because she had enough experience with men like Edmund Hawthorne to know that performed respectability was the thing they were most skilled at seeing through. The second was too blunt, which surprised her because she had thought bluntness was always preferable to performance. But she read it back and heard something in it that sounded like defensiveness, like a woman explaining why she deserved to be taken seriously, and she was not willing to explain that. She was not going to make that argument. Either it was apparent or she would find a different way forward. The third draft was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said who she was, not her history, not her circumstances, not the story of her father's farm, or the debt, or any of the details she suspected Gideon had already reported. Just who she was in the way that she understood herself. A woman who worked, who made decisions based on available information, and who did not make promises she could not keep. The second paragraph said one thing about Evan. It said that she did not know the full shape of what they were building together, and that she was not willing to pretend otherwise, but that she had watched him closely for 2 months in conditions that showed a person plainly, and what she had seen was a man worth knowing. Not worth knowing because of his name, worth knowing in spite of the weight that name had put on him, which she now understood was considerable. She sealed it. She gave it to Evan without reading it to him. He took it and did not ask what was in it, and that was the right response, and she noticed. Edmund Hawthorne's reply arrived in 3 weeks, which was faster than she'd expected given the distance and the winter roads. Evan brought it in from the road on a January afternoon, snow on his shoulders, and set it on the kitchen table in front of her. He sat down. He waited. She opened it. Edmund Hawthorne wrote in a precise, slightly compressed hand that suggested a man who had things to say and did not believe in wasting paper. The letter was 4 paragraphs. The first acknowledged her letter. The second, and here Clara paused, read it again, then set the letter flat on the table. The second said that he had read it twice, and that he appreciated the absence of anything designed to impress him, as he had been impressed and later disappointed by impressive things enough times to have lost his enthusiasm for them. The third paragraph said he would come in March as planned, and that he hoped she would be willing to meet him, and that he had no particular expectations of what she should be, only of what he hoped Evan had been, which was honest eventually, and not too late. The fourth paragraph said, "Your father raised wheat. My brother raised cattle. Both are honest work, and I have never respected one more than the other, regardless of what the ledger says at the end of the season." Clara put the letter down. Evan was watching her face. "He's not what I expected," she said. "He's better in letters," Evan said. "In person, he's more complicated." "How so?" "He means what he says. He's also accustomed to getting what he wants, and he's learned over 50 years to make those two things coexist, which requires a particular kind of management that he has perfected." Evan paused. "He'll like you." "That's not necessarily simple." "Why not?" "Because when my uncle likes someone, he tries to find a way to be useful to them, and his version of useful is usually large." Clara looked at the letter again. "I can manage large," she said. "I know you can." He said it without any quality of flattery, just as a statement of observed fact, which was how she preferred to receive it. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer with the good pen. She had 2 months before March. 2 months in which to decide what she wanted her terms to be when Edmund Hawthorne arrived, what she was willing to accept and what she was not, and how to present both without either performing deference or performing resistance, which were 2 sides of the same bad habit. 2 months in which to figure out the other thing that she had been circling without landing on since December. January moved through the farm the way January does, slowly, with a kind of relentless gray that makes time feel both too long and too short. The east field was locked under snow. The horses needed more feed than the summer months. Clara's hands cracked at the knuckles from the cold and the dry air, and she rubbed tallow into them at night the way her mother had taught her, sitting by the stove while Evan read, and Brackett snored and the wind worked at the windows. It was ordinary. That was the thing that continued to catch her off guard. How ordinary it had become. How the presence of this man in her house had stopped being something she was adjusting to and had become something she adjusted around. The way you adjust around a piece of furniture that belongs in the room, not noticing it until you imagine the room without it, at which point the absence is suddenly very specific and loud. She was imagining the room without him more than she'd admit, not because she wanted the room empty again, because she was trying to understand the degree to which she didn't. It was Brackett who made her admit it, in the way that animals sometimes force honesty by being so straightforwardly themselves that you run out of room to be complicated. The old dog had slowed through January, his hips giving him trouble in the cold, and he'd taken to spending most of his time on the rug by the stove rather than following Clara through the farm the way he'd always done. She'd noticed but told herself it was just the weather, just the cold making his old joints stiff, the way the cold made her own joints stiff some mornings. One evening she came in from checking the horses to find Evan on the floor beside Brackett, sitting with his back against the stove, one hand resting on the dog's flank, not petting, just resting there. The lamp was low. The room was warm. Evan was not reading. He was just sitting with the dog the way you sit with something that needs company more than it needs anything else. He looked up when she came in. He did not move. Clara took off her coat and hung it on the hook and stood there for a moment looking at the two of them, the old dog and the man with the complicated name. And she felt something move through her that she had been managing and redirecting and carefully not naming for 3 months. She sat down on the floor on the other side of Brackett. This was not a thing she planned or decided. Her body just made the decision while her head was still forming arguments about it. The three of them sat by the stove together. Brackett's breathing was slow and even under their hands. The fire crackled. Outside the wind was doing what the wind did, and in here it was warm and it was quiet and there was nowhere else to be. "He's slowing down," Evan said, quietly. "I know." Her voice came out thicker than she expected. She cleared it. "He'll be 12 in the spring. That's a good run for a hound." "Don't," she said. He was quiet. Then, "Sorry. No." She pressed her hand more firmly against Brackett's side. "You're right. He's been here since I was 14. He's the last thing that remembers what this house was like when my mother was alive." She stopped. "That sounds foolish." "It doesn't," Evan said, simply. She looked at him across the dog. His face in the low light was the face she'd been reading for months. The careful eyes, the particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered to him, the absence of any urge to fill silence with performance. It was a face she had memorized without meaning to, in the way you memorize things you are around daily, and then one day discover you know by heart. "Evan," she said. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not respond right away." He looked at her steadily. "All right." "I was wrong about why I married you," she said. "I told myself it was practical, and it was practical, and I don't think that's a bad reason. But it wasn't the whole reason, and I knew it wasn't the whole reason, and I didn't say so because I wasn't ready to say so." She looked at Brackett's side rising and falling under her hand. "You were kind." That was the part I didn't include in the calculation. You were kind in a way that wasn't performing itself, and I had forgotten. I had actually forgotten that that was something a person could be without wanting something in return for it. She stopped. "That's the part I was responding to when I said yes. Not just practicality." The room was very quiet. "You said not to respond right away," Evan said. "I know what I said. I'm trying to honor that." "You don't have to honor it that literally." He made a small sound that in other circumstances might have been a laugh. Then he was quiet again. Not the processing kind of quiet, but the kind that comes when someone is being careful with something they don't want to handle wrong. "I have been in love with you," he said finally, "since approximately the 4th morning I woke up on this farm and understood that I was going to do anything it took to stay." He said it the way he said things that were completely true, without decoration, without building up to it. "I didn't say it because you told me this was practical, and I was not going to make you feel that your terms had been violated. Your terms are yours. They always have been." Clara looked at him. Brackett made a small sound in his sleep and resettled. "You're a very frustrating man," Clara said. "I've been told. Because you keep being right about things." "Not about the important things," he said. "I was wrong about the most important thing, which was that keeping the secret was kinder than telling the truth. I've thought about that every day since December, and I haven't found a way to make it right in retrospect. I can only try not to make that mistake again." "Are there other secrets?" she asked. "No." He met her eyes directly. "Nothing. Whatever you want to know about my family, the money, the contracts, the land, ask and I'll answer. There's nothing I'm holding back." She believed him. Not because she was naive about the ways people held things back. She was not naive about that. She had ample experience. But because she had been watching him for 3 months, and she had learned the tells of a person managing a concealment. The particular way attention shifts when a subject is approached. The quality of a pause that is choosing rather than thinking. She had cataloged all of it in Evan, and in December she'd understood that what she'd been reading as secrets was one secret singular, and it had been named, and what was underneath it was consistent. She nodded once. He nodded once back. They sat on the floor with the old dog until the fire needed banking, and then they both got up and moved around the kitchen in the easy, unspoken way they'd developed. Clara banking the fire, Evan checking the water, Brackett watching them both from the rug with the patient benevolence of an old animal who has decided everything is fine. Nothing dramatic happened. No declaration, no embrace, no scene. Just two people who had said large, true things to each other agreeing, in the wordless way that people sometimes agree, to move forward on different footing than they'd been on before. Clara thought that was probably more honest than the dramatic version would have been. February brought a thaw that lasted 10 days and then reversed itself, which was the kind of thing February did, and which Clara took as February's personality rather than a commentary on her circumstances. During the thaw, she walked the east field and checked the rye and found it doing exactly what Evan had said it would do, coming up through the softened ground in thin, determined rows, green against the brown soil, quietly becoming what it was going to be. She stood in the east field for a while, just looking at it. She thought about her father walking this same ground in early spring, every year she could remember, stopping to crouch and check what was coming up. He had done it with the particular seriousness of a man who understood that the gap between planting and harvest was not empty. It was full of things that could go wrong, and the paying of attention was the only honest response to that. She had planted things this winter too. Some of them were in the ground. Some of them were harder to see, but growing the same way. In the dark, without announcement, doing the slow structural work before there was anything visible to show for it. She walked back to the house. March came with mud and pale light and the specific smell of ground that is thawing for real this time and meaning it. The creek ran loud and fast under the broken ice. The horses moved differently, looser, like animals remembering what it felt like to not be cold. And Edmund Hawthorne sent word that he would arrive on the 14th. Clara spent the week before the 14th neither preparing excessively nor pretending she wasn't preparing at all, which was a balance she found genuinely difficult. She cleaned the house the way she always cleaned it, which was thoroughly and without fuss. She cooked what she would have cooked for anyone she was feeding, which was good food, properly made, not performance food. She wore her own clothes. She did not wear the blue dress. Evan watched all of this without comment, which was the right response, and she told him so. "The blue dress?" he asked. "The blue dress is for funerals and weddings," she said. "This is a negotiation." "Is it?" "Everything is a negotiation," she said. "The only question is who knows it." Evan almost smiled. "My uncle is going to find you very interesting." "Good," Clara said. "Let him find me interesting. Interesting people get taken seriously." Edmund Hawthorne arrived on a Tuesday. He came in a proper carriage with two men riding alongside, which Clara noted as both a show of status and a genuine security precaution, which told her he was a man who did not make unnecessary shows, but also did not pretend the shows that were necessary were something else. She could work with that. He was taller than she'd expected, broader. He had Evan's eyes in a different arrangement, less watchful, more direct. The eyes of a man who had decided long ago that the world would come to him rather than the other way around, and had been largely right. He was perhaps 60, his hair gone fully white, and he walked up her path with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned property in 4 counties and had never had to pretend otherwise. He stopped at the porch. He looked at Clara. He looked at the house. He looked at the east field, where the rye was now visibly up in full green rows. He looked at the fence line, which was in better repair than it had been in years. He looked back at Clara. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. His voice was lower than Gideon's, less managed. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "You look like your letter," he said. "I wrote it too," she said. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile and was not quite approval but was in the vicinity of both. He came up the porch steps and she opened the door, and he came inside, and Brackett lifted his head from the rug, assessed Edmund Hawthorne with the unhurried judgment of an old dog who had stopped being polite about what he thought of people, and put his head back down. "The dog likes no one?" Edmund said. "The dog likes Evan," Clara said. "His standards are high." Evan appeared from the kitchen. The moment between them, uncle and nephew, was complicated in the way that family moments are when there is a history that runs deeper than the current conversation. They shook hands. Not a cold handshake, not a warm one. The handshake of two people who know each other too well for formal warmth and not well enough right now for the other kind. "You look better than I expected," Edmund said. "You expected worse," Evan said. Gideon's report was not encouraging. "Gideon sees what he's sent to see." Edmund made a sound that might have been agreement and sat down at the kitchen table in the chair Clara indicated, and she put coffee in front of him, and she sat down, and Evan sat down, and that was how the meeting with Edmund Hawthorne began. Around the same table where she'd spread the bank papers and worried about Gerald Pruitt and listened to Evan explain soil rotation at 3 in the morning. It was a long afternoon. Edmund was, as Evan had said, more complicated in person than in letters. He was direct, and he meant what he said, and he also moved through a conversation the way a man moves through a house. He's furnished himself, knowing where everything was, knowing which rooms he was choosing to open and which he was keeping closed. Clara found him interesting, which she had prepared herself to do, and also found him occasionally infuriating, which she had also prepared herself for. The infuriating part arrived about an hour in, when Edmund turned to her with the expression of a man who has decided to be generous and said, "I'd like to resolve the farm's debt as a wedding gift. It's a modest amount by Hawthorne standards, and it would—" "No," Clara said. Edmund stopped. Evan went very still in the way that meant he was being careful not to show what was on his face. "No?" Edmund said. "I appreciate the offer," Clara said, and she meant it, her voice carrying that particular quality of meaning, something you're also refusing. "The debt on this farm is mine to resolve. I have a plan for resolving it. The spring crop will cover most of it, and the Harlan loan will be repaid before summer." She looked at Edmund directly. "If I accept your money to clear the debt, I spend the next 10 years wondering whether the farm is standing because it should be standing or because the Hawthorns decided it should. I'd rather know." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. "Evan," he said, without looking away from Clara. "Yes," Evan said. "You said she was straightforward." "I said she was honest. Straightforward is your word." Edmund looked at Clara for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank from it and set it back down and said, "What would you accept?" "Information," Clara said, "about the railroad spur. The timeline, the access negotiation, who's already positioned, and what a fair counterposition looks like. I don't need your money. I need to know what I'm sitting on and how to use it without someone else using it for me." Silence. "You want to negotiate the easement yourself," Edmund said. "I want to understand it well enough to negotiate it myself, yes, with Evan's help." She glanced at Evan briefly. "He's been keeping me informed. I want to be fully informed." Edmund set his cup down. He looked at his nephew. "Where did you find her?" he said. "At a fence," Evan said. Edmund looked back at Clara. "The railroad access point on the creek section is worth approximately 12 years of crop income at current market rates," he said, "if the negotiation is handled correctly." "I'm aware of that now," Clara said. "Tell me what handling it correctly looks like." He told her. Not all of it that afternoon. It took the evening too, and Evan was in it with her, and by the time Edmund's men brought in his things from the carriage and settled in the barn for the night, Clara had more information about the railroad negotiation than Gerald Pruitt had been sitting on for 8 months, and she had a clearer picture of the Hawthorne family's regional interests than she'd had at breakfast. And she was tired in the specific way that comes from using your mind hard, which was the most honest kind of tired she knew. Edmund stayed 2 days. On the first evening, after Evan had gone to check the horses, Edmund sat at the kitchen table with the last of his coffee and looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has made an assessment and is considering whether to share it. She let him sit with it. She was not going to pull it out of him. "He was different before," Edmund said finally. "My nephew. Before his father died. He was not cold, reserved, smart in a way that stayed inside, didn't go out to meet people." He turned his cup. "He came back from wherever he was with something different in him. I didn't recognize it at first. I thought it was just the experience, the hardship. But it's not that." He looked at her. "It's the specific difference that comes from having been seen clearly and not found wanting. That's harder to come by than people think." Clara looked at the table. "He deserved to be seen clearly," she said. "He earned it." "I think so too," Edmund said. "I just thought you should know that I know what you gave him, and that it matters." Clara looked up. Edmund Hawthorne, heir to 200,000 acres and railroad contracts, and the particular weight of a name that shaped the landscape around it, held her gaze without flinching and without performance. "Thank you," she said. It came out simpler than she intended, and she left it that way. On the second morning, before Edmund's carriage was packed, he stood in the yard and looked at the property the way he'd looked at it when he arrived. The east field, the fence line, the repaired barn roof. Evan stood beside him. Clara stood on the porch. "The creek section," Edmund said. "Pruitt's still after it." "He'll keep being after it," Evan said. "I can block his access to the bank connections." "Don't," Clara said from the porch. Both men turned. "Let him try through the bank. By the time the spring numbers come in, there won't be anything for him to buy." She paused. "I'd rather beat him straight than have him blocked sideways. That way he knows it was me." Edmund looked at her for a moment. He looked at Evan. "She's going to be a considerable problem for a number of people," he said. "I know," Evan said. He didn't say it like it was a difficulty. Edmund left on a Tuesday morning with the mud still thick on the road and the sky pale and high and the particular quality of light that belongs to early spring. Not warm yet, but honest. Present. Committed to arriving. Clara watched the carriage go and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was something adjacent to miss him before he was fully out of sight. Not because the visit had been easy. It hadn't been easy. It had been the kind of necessary difficult that you come out of changed in ways you couldn't entirely map yet. Gerald Pruitt made his final move in April. He went to the bank directly and made a formal offer on the creek section, citing Clara's outstanding balance and the bank's own timeline for resolution. And for approximately 3 days, the situation was genuinely uncertain, which Clara experienced as a specific quality of cold focus that she recognized as the state she entered when things were serious, and she did not have the luxury of being afraid. She appeared at the bank on the 4th day with the spring crop numbers, which were better than projected. The winter rye had done what Evan said it would do, and with a document that Evan had helped her prepare, outlining the creek section's railroad easement value, and her intention to negotiate that easement directly, which meant the land was worth significantly more than the outstanding debt, and the bank's willingness to sell it at a loss was, from a fiduciary standpoint, not supportable. The bankman looked at the document. He looked at Clara. He looked at the numbers. "Where did you get the railroad assessment?" he said. "My husband provided it," Clara said. "He has access to the relevant planning documents." The bankman knew who her husband was. Hollow Creek had known who her husband was since January. He looked at the document again. "The Pruitt offer," he said carefully, "is below the land's actual value," Clara said. "As I think you've now been informed." The bankman set the document down. He looked at it for another moment, the way people look at things that have resolved a problem they were hoping would resolve itself. "I'll need a week to process the spring figures," he said. "Of course," Clara said. She walked out of the bank into the April mud and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment with the sun on her face, pale and thin but genuine, the first real sun of the year. Gerald Pruitt's offer was declined. Clara made her payment on the Harlan loan in May, 2 weeks ahead of the due date, and she paid interest on top of principal, and she paid it in person, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table while Ruth made unnecessary amounts of food and pretended not to look pleased with herself. And Clara let her because Ruth had taken a risk when she hadn't had to. And being pleased with how it had gone was not something Clara was going to reduce. Spring on the farm was the busiest season, and this spring was the busiest Clara had known, because the farm was genuinely healthy now in a way it hadn't been since before her father got sick. And health in a farm means more to manage, more to tend, more decisions to make, which was not a complaint. Clara did not experience work as a complaint. She experienced it as the proof that something was alive. Evan worked beside her. That was the shape of their days, side by side, which was literal and also something else that she had stopped needing to translate. There was an evening in late May when they were both in the east field checking the wheat that had gone in after the rye, the light going long and gold the way May light does, bracket line at the edge of the field, watching them in the patient way he'd taken to, and Evan looked up from the row he was checking and looked at her across the wheat, and she looked back and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I owe you a proper conversation," Evan said. "About what?" "About the fact that I love you and I haven't said it clearly since the floor by the stove, and I think it deserves a clearer saying." Clara looked at him. The light was in his face. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been through something and had not come out of it unscathed and was not pretending otherwise. Standing in a wheat field in a borrowed coat that was now his, working ground that was not his, and that he treated with more care than some people treated their own. "I love you too," she said. It came out without the ceremony she'd probably been saving it for, just clean and flat and true, in the middle of the wheat field with the evening light on both of them. "I have for a while." "I know," he said. "Don't be smug about it." "I'm not smug about anything when it comes to you," he said. I notice things." "Too many things," she said. "Maybe." She turned back to the row she was checking. He turned back to his. They kept working, which was what there was to do, and the field was quiet around them, and the light was warm, and Brackett thumped his tail once against the ground at the edge of the field, and that was all. The railroads came through Callow Creek in the fall, as Edmund had said they would, and the negotiation for the creek section easement was handled by Clara and Evan together, with Edmund's information and Clara's particular quality of not blinking when people wanted her to blink. The figure they settled on was more than Gerald Pruitt's best offer for the entire property. The bankman heard about it secondhand and did not come to congratulate her, which Clara considered a response in itself. Gerald Pruitt sold his own property the following spring and relocated 2 counties north, which the town discussed at length. Clara did not discuss it. She had spent enough of her life being aware of Gerald Pruitt, and was glad to spend the rest of it less so. Edmund Hawthorne came back the following November, which was becoming a pattern Clara had not anticipated and was not entirely opposed to. He came with fewer attendants this time and stayed longer and spent considerable time in the East Field with Evan, talking about things Clara wasn't party to, and she let them have those conversations because there were debts between them that were older than her and not hers to settle. One afternoon, she found Edmund on the porch with Brackett, who was moving even more slowly now and had developed the specific dignity of very old animals, unhurried, unimpressed, entirely himself. Edmund was sitting in the chair with his hands on his knees, and Brackett was beside him, and Edmund was not talking to the dog or petting him. He was just sitting with him, which was the right thing to do. Clara brought out coffee and sat in the other chair. "He told you about the arrangement," Edmund said. Not a question. "Which arrangement?" "He's restructured the Northern Holdings, removed my management authority from 3 of the properties." Edmund looked out at the field. "He gave me notice last night." Clara looked at him. "Are you angry?" "No." Edmund said it with some thought, like he'd been asking himself the same question. I managed those properties the way I thought best for 15 years. The way my brother taught me to manage, which was efficient and not unkind, but also did not lose sleep over what happened to the people whose small holdings got absorbed." He picked up his coffee. "Evan is going to manage differently. Is that a problem?" "For the ledger, short term, yes." He looked at her. "For the ledger 20 years out, I don't know. He may be right. He sees things I'm trained not to see." Another pause. "You have something to do with that." "Maybe," Clara said. "Or maybe he always saw them and needed somewhere to put the seeing." Edmund looked at her for a moment. Then he made a sound. Not a laugh exactly, but the sound that lives next to laughter in people who have gotten out of the habit. "You're good for him," he said. "We're good for each other," Clara said. "There's a difference." The fence along the north edge of the property was repaired again that winter. Not because it had failed, but because Evan went over it every year the way her father had gone over his ground every spring, because that was the kind of attention he gave to things he cared about, and Clara had long since stopped finding this strange. She found him there one February morning, the kind of cold, clear day when the sky is an impossible blue, and the light has no warmth in it, but so much brightness, you have to squint. And he was working the 3rd post from the eastern corner, the one that had been the first post he'd driven when he came to this farm, half dead, and carrying a name he'd decided to put down for a while. She stood at the edge of the field and watched him. She thought about what it cost people to be seen. Not observed, seen. The real version, the one where someone looks at what you actually are and decides to keep looking. She had not known, when she crouched beside that collapsed figure at the fence line all those months ago, that she was deciding anything that would matter. She'd been doing the next practical thing, the way she always did. But the next practical thing had turned out to contain everything. That was the thing nobody told you about small decisions made in honest moments. They didn't look like the kind of decisions that changed the shape of your life. They looked like checking if someone was still breathing. They looked like bringing broth to the barn. They looked like saying yes in a cold October yard to a man who had nothing, and meaning it, and not yet knowing what nothing meant. Evan looked up and saw her standing at the field's edge. He straightened. She walked toward him. The frozen ground was hard under her boots, and the air was still, and the light was the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more itself, sharper, truer, no softening. She stopped beside him. He looked at her. She looked at the post, the fence, the field beyond it, the creek in the distance still half-iced, the farm laid out in the pale winter light doing what farms do, which is quietly insisting on continuing. Post doesn't need it, she said. I know. Stubborn habit. Yes, he said. She stood beside him and looked at the fence that had started everything. The fence she'd been walking toward on an ordinary October morning when ordinary October mornings still existed, before the thing that changed was changed. She thought, this is what it looks like. Not the ending you imagine when you're in the middle of something, not triumphant, not smooth, not arrived, just the next morning and the one after it, with someone who keeps showing up to the fence even when the fence doesn't need him, because showing up is the thing he knows how to do and has decided to keep doing. It was enough. More than enough. Come in when you're done, she said. There's coffee. 10 minutes, he said. She turned and walked back toward the house, her father's house, her house, their house, with the cold air and the bright light and the sound of the hammer starting again behind her, steady and unhurried, the sound of someone doing the work because the work is there and because this is where they have chosen to be. Brackett was at the door when she reached the porch, moving slowly, tail going. She scratched his ears and he leaned into her hand, the way he'd been leaning into her hand for 12 years, with the total and unambiguous commitment of an old dog who has made his choices and is at peace with them. She opened the door and went inside. The coffee was still hot.